We're moving into the Gospel of John. We're starting at the very first verse of the second chapter. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So last week, if you were here, we saw Jesus get baptized in the River Jordan, his baptism of commissioning, the official beginning, the inauguration, if you will, of his saving mission on earth. It's kind of a dramatic thing. He comes up out of the water. God speaks his blessing from heaven. Jesus stands up brimming with the power of the Almighty. And what's the first thing he does? Well, if you'd been given that kind of power, what would be the first thing you'd do? I'd do something dramatic. I can't think of what, but it'd be flashy. Jesus keeps a wedding from running out of wine. That's what he does with all that power. Weddings in the ancient world were a slightly different thing than they are nowadays, of course. And running out of wine for them would be a bigger problem than having your punch fountain go dry today. To the Jews of Jesus' day, weddings were celebrations of life in a world where death was so much closer to people than it is today. We are kind of a death-defying culture. We know people die, but we don't actually confront death all that much. We have sort of shopped that out to the professionals, and that's fine. But in the thinking of the first century, weddings were a celebration of obedience to God's command to be fruitful and multiply. They were testimonies, if you will, that in the midst of a harsh world, lives were still worth living, and God was still good, and hope was not wasted energy. So they were big deals. They were symbolic of the command of God, their unity in the covenant God made with them, a sign of hope in an otherwise maybe not so hopeful world. And right in the middle of this particular wedding, then, the wine is running out. But wine is not just a drink, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of joy and of gladness and of happiness and abundance, the good stuff in life. Psalm 104 praises God for all of his best gifts. And would it surprise you that wine is prominently mentioned? God is glorified for giving the gift of wine that makes glad the human heart. At the pinnacle of this social celebration, you don't want to run out of the stuff that gladdens human hearts. And the good news is this wedding has a happy ending, right? Jesus restocks the wine supply with the best wine anybody has ever tasted, about 1,000 bottles worth. This is how Jesus unleashes his divine power for the very first time, how he begins his official ministry of salvation by turning water into wine. I think that's kind of a surprising way to start. And before we talk about the miracle itself, I want to take a look at the actions of several of the people at this wedding who kind of set the stage for this miracle. First, there's the bride and groom. Their contribution to all of this is simply that they invited Jesus to their wedding, their big day. Now, that might not seem so spectacular, but I can't tell you how many times I've officiated at weddings where, despite all the pomp and circumstance, you kind of got the feeling that Jesus wasn't really invited to the wedding. I can't count how many conversations I've had with people who have no place for Jesus in their lives. And the sad fact is, in our world, Jesus is unwelcome in more human hearts than he is an invited guest. But he is on the guest list of this wedding, and that turns out to make all the difference. And then there's Mary, Jesus' mother. She's at the wedding too. And John simply says, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Now, I think this is one of the most interesting and humorous sentences in the whole Bible. It contains the last recorded words we ever hear from Mary. And it relates, I think, one of the most human moments in Jesus' life. It appears Mary has to talk Jesus into kind of intervening. He thinks that his ministry is slightly above, turning water into wine. And of course, he'll do it, but he objects a little bit. And Mary says, "Well, you do whatever he tells you," and then she kind of leaves. And in my mind's eye, there's Jesus with everybody looking at him. And he has this warrant from his mother to do something, which he does. And he doesn't do it grudgingly, right? He doesn't do it parsimoniously. He doesn't, make a case of wine. He makes a bathtub full of wine, the best wine that's ever been tasted. Wouldn't it be great to have that much honesty about facing life's problems and that much faith that Jesus knew just what to do, and not only that he could do something, that he would do something? Most of the time, that kind of honesty and that kind of faith hard to come by. We're not good, at least I'm not very good at admitting I've got a problem that's bigger than I am. And when we do admit that, don't we sort of try to solve it anyway by ourselves? Admitting that we're not perfect, and that we might need some help, and that we're not completely in control all the time is, for most of us, I think, painful. It's so painful we don't come to God as much or as quickly as we might. And that causes its own kind of pain. But not at this wedding, not with Mary. Then there are the servants. To their great credit, they do exactly what Jesus tells them to do. Jesus wants jars, they bring jars. Jesus wants them filled with water, they fill them with water. Jesus wants them to take a sample to their boss. That's what they do. Do you think they were terribly, hopeful that this was going to turn out okay? Who knows? We don't know. And then the miracle happens as they do everything Jesus tells them to do. Now, this is not a lesson in blind obedience, but it is a testimony against thinking that we're smarter than God is. Think about it. All involved at that wedding feast knew what big trouble they were in. And I'm sure Jesus' way of solving the wine problem wasn't that much comfort them in the early going. Big jars, plain water, yeah, we're making progress. Just how drunk does this rabbi think these people are that they won't, know that they're being served tap water after all the wine has run out? But they still do what Jesus tells them to do, right? They play along, they listen, and they react. They give Jesus what they got. Big jars and plain water. None of it is terribly spectacular. None of it seems too helpful at the time. And there probably is a whole lot of incentive just to, drop everything and get out of there before the guests get surly. But the servants stay. And in staying, they stand in good company. Throughout the history of Israel, God has asked people for ordinary things and has done extraordinary things with them. Think about Abraham. God asked Abraham to bring his son. Moses, his staff. David, his sling. The widow of Zarephath, the last little bit of her flour and oil. Jesus asked a little boy for his lunch one day and fed thousands and thousands of people. None of these things seemed sufficient to make any difference at all. And with these few tokens, as the only raw material available, each of these situations seemed as hopeless as this wedding, a huge party and no more wine. But instead, something inside these individuals in the history of Israel told them to hang in there and do what God asked them to do and to bring him what little they had. And something miraculous happened every single time. What's the message here? Well, God is not looking for your ability. Yeah? God is looking for your availability. God is looking for the availability of your heart to trust him, to believe amazing things can happen when God is invited into them, and when the rest of the world is given up hope to expect wonderful things are still possible. That's what Abraham did. And God not only spared his son, but made him the father of a whole nation. That's what Moses did, and with his staff, God parted the Red Sea and led his people to freedom. That's what David did with his little sling and 5 stones, and he defeated Goliath and put an end to tyranny. That's what the widow of Zarephath did. And with her day's ration of flour and oil, she was able to feed the prophet Elijah and her whole family 4 months. That's what the little boy did. And with his 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, he helped Jesus feed tens of thousands. All because they trusted Jesus. I think the message here is you can trust him too. You can expect wonderful things because God isn't a just enough kind of God. And neither is his son. The feeding of the multitude, in that miracle, Jesus doesn't produce just enough food for everybody, but enough to have baskets full of leftovers. At the wedding, Jesus doesn't make just enough wine to eke through the rest of the day, but he makes more and better wine than anybody had ever encountered. My cup overflows, the writer of the 23rd Psalm says, and I bet you those wedding guests were singing right along with him at the end of that wedding. The punchline to this whole story is very simple. Jesus' presence and power changes things. When that happens, we call it a miracle. That day at Cana, Jesus' presence and power changed more than water into wine. He changed nothing into something, bad into good, despair into rejoicing. And he made that change in a big and unmistakable way. Jesus changed that wedding from the brink of disaster into one for the record books. So astounding that we're still talking about this one wedding 2,000 years later. Jesus changed that wedding into something better than anybody could have ever imagined it to be. And what he did in the lives of that bride and groom, he can do in your life too. Your life can be the next place Jesus visits, the next place he pours his love and power and makes things better than you could have ever imagined. The bride and groom were lucky to have a friend like Jesus. And I hope you know you've got a friend like that too. Now, it might be hard to imagine why Jesus would want to come into your life completely and overwhelm you with abundance. After all, who are we? What have we done to deserve? But the bride and groom, just like us, they really didn't deserve that miracle. I don't know that anybody deserves miracles, but got them anyway. And that's what God's grace is like. There's no measure to it. It never gives out. And it's not about us deserving, right? It's about God's desire to move miraculously in our lives. Yeah, God's grace never gives out. We do, right? Because everything about us is finite. And that's why we need Jesus. Because Jesus can change water into wine. He can change a little boy's lunch into a feast for thousands. He can transform a little shepherd boy into a mighty king. And if he can do all that, imagine what he can do in your life and in my life. You know, the kind of stuff we need. Can he turn sorrow into joy? Yes, he can. Sin into forgiveness? Yep. Hope into promise? Death into life? You and me into new creations? Yes. And if we're honest about our lives, you know, we need that kind of stuff, don't we? Because we do know sorrow. We do know sin. We do need second chances, don't we? And that's the kind of stuff Jesus does. That's the kind of stuff God's love and power and presence does. Jesus had all the power in the world. He could do anything. And the very first thing he does is to bless an unnamed bride and an unnamed groom by keeping their party going. All the power in the universe expended in the way only the servants got to see. Notice that. The same power that created the heavens and the earth, God is delighted to use for you. To remind you how much you are loved, to come to your rescue, to show up when you need Him the most, to remind all of us that God cares about the little things too. Does He care about the big things? Sure He does. Does He care about the little things? Does He see the things that even most of us don't see or maybe see and ignore? Yes. Yes, He does. So if this story teaches us anything, I suppose it teaches us that, no prayer is ever wasted. No need is too small. No request is too big. So invite Jesus in. And if you've invited Him in, as I'm sure most of us have, invite Him in a little deeper. Bring your needs to Him. Do whatever He says. Give Him whatever you have. And then expect miraculous things. That's what they did at the wedding of Cana a long time ago. And you know how that turned out. I invite you to pray with me. Good and gracious God, thank you so much for reminding us of how powerful you are and how generous you are with that power. That you would notice the little things and move miraculously toward them with the same generosity as you move miraculously toward huge things. Help us to remember that we are not too small. We are not too insignificant. Our problems are not too little to gain your notice and your concern and the healing power of your touch. And so release us from everything that might suggest to us that we shouldn't really share with you everything that's going on with us, that you're too busy or we're not important enough. The fact of the matter is, by your own Son's presence and power, we know that we are important enough to you. And if we're that important to you, then should we not also be that important to one another? So help us to ask for your miraculous presence. Help us to share that presence with our neighbors. Help us to build our lives around the assurance that you are, and that you love, that you are with us, and that you are for us. And help us to be that way for everyone else. Would you do that for us, Lord, before we pray it in the prayer that you taught us to pray? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.